This programme is about poverty. We will look at the persistence of poverty and how various governments have tried to deal with it in the last 100 years. Although Britain at this time was a very wealthy country, only a small minority of the people were rich. Out of every 100 people, 2 or 3 were living in the lap of luxury, while 25 or more were living in dire poverty. The gulf between these two worlds was huge. Few people in the rest of society had any idea about the reality of poverty. One man who determined to find out was Benjamin Seabohm Rowntree. His family had grown rich making chocolate, and he was concerned to put the fortune to good use by researching poverty in York. He found large families with as many as 10 children crammed into single rooms in small, damp houses. Disease was rife. A quarter of all children in York slums died before the age of 1. For the breadwinner, employment was casual. You could be hired and fired at will, and the pay was low. To supplement the family income, children and their mothers often had to work, rather than going to school or staying at home. Their wages would have been pitiful. Rowntree was appalled by what he found.
That in this land of abounding wealth, during a time of prosperity, probably more than a quarter of the population are living in poverty, is a fact that may well cause great searchings of the heart.
If there was no work, poor families would often have to raise money by pawning their possessions. Pawn shops, with their characteristic sign of 3 brass globes, were a common sight in poor areas. They made a profit out of poverty. People would hand over their most valuable items, scraps of jewellery perhaps, or the Sunday best suit. In exchange, they'd be given money and a ticket for every item pawned. Once the family had a bit of money again, they could get their goods back by repaying the loan with interest. Rowntree found that the poor experienced particular hardship at least 3 times in their lives. Because this boy was born into a large family with many mouths to feed, his early years were spent in poverty. As he grew up and began to earn, things improved for him, until of course he began to have his own large family. Once again, times became hard. Finally, in old age, if he lived that long, poverty would strike him again. Rowntree's report shocked society and prompted the first serious measures by a government to deal with poverty. They were called the Liberal Reforms. For children, school meals and medical checks. For those over 70, a pension of 5 shillings a week. For the working man, sickness and unemployment pay. Ironically, the First World War did more to alleviate poverty than any laws. The huge demand for manpower in the army and in the industries which supplied them wiped out unemployment, raised wages, and bettered living conditions for millions of working-class families. The war also highlighted the devastating effects of poverty. Such was the poor health of the working classes that of 2.5 million men who were called up in 1917, over 1.5 million were deemed physically unfit for full military duties. With the war over, full employment ended. Hopes for a better world, the right to live and the right to work, were soon dashed. The conditions described by Rowntree persisted. Andy Wardby grew up in the slums of York during the 1920s.
There was no wallpaper on the walls, and you could lay back in bed and watch the bugs walking up the walls.
The Wardby family survived on a diet of stale food and scraps.
My mother and I, we were not allowed to eat until my dad is. We had to have what was left.
Meat on the plate was something to remember.
Sheep's heads. And sheep's heads were put in a stew in the pan. Well, we always used to say, if you leave the eyes in, they'll see you through the week.
The only surviving photograph of Andy as a child, taken in 1929, has the title Happy Days. But the truth was that for people like Andy, death and disease were a way of life.
My aunt, she had a little daughter called Louie. Even to this day I can remember going into the house to see my Aunt Emma. And on the kitchen table, that's where they used to put the coffins, on the kitchen table. And I saw little Louie in a coffin on the table, and that's what they used to do.
By the 1930s, Britain was in the grip of an economic slump. In 1932, 22% of the population were out of work. The liberal reforms were never devised to cope with hardship on such a vast scale. The government was hard-pressed to pay out so much dole money and sought ways to cut it back. Before a family could receive any dole, an assessment was made to see how needy they were. This was known as the means test. Inspectors would visit the house and make an estimate of the amount the family could raise, for example by the sale of any furniture the inspector considered inessential. This sum would be deducted from their benefit. Hundreds of thousands of claims were disallowed, saving the government millions of pounds at the expense of the poorest in society. The means test became a source of great bitterness. The decade was marked by hunger marches, violence, and a divided nation.
It's been so bad at times for men not to get a job. I have actually seen men taken away in straitjackets because of cutting their throats, committing suicide.
The writer George Orwell spent some time living in working-class areas in order to see at first hand the effects of unemployment.
It is a deadly thing to see a skilled man running to seed, year after year, in utter hopeless idleness. We may as well face the fact that several million men in England will, unless another war breaks out, never have a real job this side of the grave.
Orwell was right. Once again, war solved the unemployment crisis at a stroke. Everyone was needed again. Rationing ensured that for the first time, everyone had the same to eat. Even at the height of the conflict, people began to think about rebuilding a better Britain after the war.
I've been thinking about the gaps between the houses. What comes down has to go up again, you know.
Not like it used to be, I hope.
Not with all those slums and tenements.
That's just the point. We've got to see that the job's done decently this time. If we can work together now to look after the lives of the people here, I don't see why we couldn't work together afterwards to clear up the mess and help build a better world in which these things can't possibly happen.
I'll second that.
The task of drawing up a blueprint for the future fell to William Beveridge. This new Britain needed a big idea to cope with long-term unemployment and kill off the poverty cycle. The Beveridge solution aimed to give everyone economic security from the cradle to the grave through a scheme of national insurance.
We shall take the first step to security with freedom and responsibility. That is what we all desire.
There was widespread support for the Beveridge Plan, and the post-war Labour government pledged to make it a reality. The welfare state was born.
Blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see.
Improved pensions for all.
Bluebirds singing.
Free secondary education for all.
Nothing but bluebirds all day long.
And a free national health service for all. Beveridge was a tonic to the nation. But the battle to clear the bomb-damaged housing and slums had yet to be won.
Row upon row of dirty, dismal houses that should have been pulled down and done away with long ago. Homes without any proper sanitation, where every drop of water has to be carried up and down the stairs in buckets. And the only place for the cooking stove is on the stairway landing. Homes where whole families live, eat and sleep all together in one room.
John Bird grew up in conditions like this during the 1950s in London.
There was very bad sanitation. There was outside toilets, which was shared by 25 people. We lived in a front room in the house that I was born in, and my parents used to sleep in the kitchen, which was out the back, and my brothers, at the time that I was born, I had two elder brothers, and they slept on the floor by the window, and I slept between two armchairs. I always remember slipping down the middle, and even then I used to think, I wish my parents would get me out of this.
Like millions of others, John and his family eventually got into better housing. As the nation got gradually wealthier, the slums, child mortality and starvation diets of earlier days became a thing of the past. In the 1960s, it was thought poverty was beaten. By the 1990s, it's clear that was wrong. Changes in society have caused new forms of poverty. Work for unskilled people has become more difficult to find in a technological age. Single parents fell through Beveridge's safety net, as his reforms had only been designed to help the traditional family unit. In 1996, the Child Poverty Action Group produced a report. The findings were startling. 13.7 million people, most of them women, and 1 in 4 children were found to be living in poverty today. The destitution of the Roundtree days had gone, but they found a lot of people whose living standards fell far below what we expect today. As one young mother says,
"Make them understand. I've got £40 a week. How do I manage?"
Single-parent Kath Leaper sleeps downstairs so that her 6 children can have the beds, such as they are.
It's very hard to survive on income support with 6 children because there's not enough money to go round. It goes on gas, electric, and the rest is on food then. I don't like living on income support. I'd rather be out working to support my children than to have somebody else's money supporting my children. I have tried to get jobs, but with 6 children I'd have to have childminding, I'd have to be there, I'd have to have the hours to suit me because of the children, or find a childminder, which would be expensive.
But poverty today is not just a question of money. It's also about a lack of opportunity.
What happens is that you get into this kind of feeling that you've got nothing in the world, that you're absolutely nothing, you're just a piece of social trash, you're just a piece of rubbish, and you lose everything. I mean, I know lots of poor people now who could not so much as boil an egg for themselves.
John Bird escaped the poverty trap. Today he runs The Big Issue, a highly successful magazine designed to help the homeless help themselves.
People who 10, 20, 30, 100 years ago could have climbed out of their poverty because there were pathways out of poverty. Those pathways have been blocked by the fact that there's not a lot of unskilled work around. And I think it's unfortunate that there is an increasing amount of people who are becoming useless in society because businesses don't want them anymore.
In 1905, a Times editorial warned of relying too much on government help to sort out the problem of poverty.
We have already relieved parents of the duty of educating their children. This is now used as an argument for relieving them of the duty of feeding their children. But what are we to expect of these children when they in turn become parents? The habit of looking to the state for their maintenance would be ingrained in them.
Without state intervention, there would have been no end to the squalor and disease with which the century began. But today, many people believe we have gone too far and created a nanny state. Can future governments do any better than those of the past? And if not, what will be the consequences for our society?
If you want social peace, where the streets are safe and everybody's happy and all that stuff, you have to have social justice. If you haven't got social justice, you can't have social peace.
This episode of History File was produced in Cardiff by BBC Wales. It was devised and created by this especially assembled team of actors, musicians, designers, technicians and programme makers, and narrated by me, Juliet Stevenson. The executive producer was Mr. Di Williams.
Watcher!
Wartime children's lives were lit by surprises. Between 1945 and 1951,